Matt Dillahunty made a video about why he doesn't believe that theological non-cognitivism is a tenable position. The definition of theological non-cognitivism that he uses, however, seems to describe a far weaker position than the one to which I am referring when I describe myself as a theological non-cognitivist.
So theological non-cognitivism, as I understand it, is essentially the claim that theological language, labels, ideas like God, have no cognitive meaning because they aren't well defined.
Sometimes it's worse than that. Sometimes theists use definitions of a God that are not merely vague, they seem outright self-contradictory. Some will say that a God is a disembodied mind. But what is a mind if it is not an activity carried out by a body of some kind? Some theists will say that a God is timeless and spaceless. But what does it mean to say that something exists if it doesn't exist in any place or for any period of time? However, because there are lots of different kinds of theists who define the word God in lots of different ways, you occasionally will find a definition that does seem coherent. Pantheism is sometimes a good example of this. There are a few different conceptions of pantheism, but the pantheists who simply define God as the universe have a perfectly coherent definition. So my theological non-cognitivism, and I suspect this applies to most if not all non-cognitivists, is relative to certain specific attempted definitions of a God. I am non-cognitivist with respect to the definition of a God that some of the more sophisticated apologists use. I don't see how William Lane Craig's conception of a God makes any sense, for example.
Those advocating for theological non-cognitivism will essentially use gibberish, a string of letters that has no cognitive content, that conveys no meaning, to bolster their point.
I've done that, but I didn't do it to bolster my point. I merely did it to illustrate my point.
And out of this kind of more formal philosophical label came another label called agnosticism, which essentially branches off perhaps a little from theological non-cognitivism to say that God is so ill-defined that it's a waste of time to even discuss it, that there's not enough cognitive meaning there for anyone to make up their mind or to have an actual position. So I'm not an atheist, I'm not an agnostic, I'm not a theist, I'm an agnostic.
Not all agnostics reject the label atheist. Usually when I hear that word used as an identity label, it's when people call themselves agnostic atheists.
And now I'm done with the conversation.
This is something I've never encountered myself. It's definitely not something I've ever said. I guess Matt ran into someone who uses agnosticism or non-cognitivism as a conversation ender. For me, though, agnosticism and theological non-cognitivism are conversation starters, not enders. If theists try to convince me that there is a God, I will start the conversation by asking what a God is, and if they give me a definition that seems self-contradictory, I will ask them to explain it further in the hope that they can resolve the apparent contradiction. And that's usually where they will end the conversation. I am more than happy to continue it from that point.
The fundamental positions coming out of theology, the doctrines, they are so confusing and so ill-defined that I think this is the reason why there's over 1,000 denominations that identify as Christian. But that doesn't mean that they're gibberish. It doesn't mean that they are without any sort of cognitive value, that they don't convey any meaning.
I guess Matt is working with a definition of theological non-cognitivism that really hinges on this term ill-defined. My agnosticism isn't really based on the fact that many definitions of God are ill-defined in the sense of being merely vague. I agree with Matt that the fact that a definition is vaguely stated does not necessarily mean that it is gibberish. But as I stated earlier, there are definitions of a God that I find to be worse than merely vague. They seem to be self-contradictory, and self-contradictory statements are gibberish. I call myself a theological non-cognitivist because I don't see how the definitions of God that seem to be most popular among apologists have any meaning. However, if the description of theological non-cognitivism that Matt is using is a correct one, and the reason why theological non-cognitivists believe that the definition of God is gibberish is merely because it is vague, rather than because it is self-contradictory, then I must be a distinct kind of theological non-cognitivist. Now, I may be correct or incorrect in my assertion that William Lane Craig's definition of a God is self-contradictory, but that's beside the point. The point I'm making is that while I agree with Matt that the fact that a conception of a God is merely ill-defined does not mean that it is gibberish, if a definition of God is self-contradictory, I think it is totally justified to say that it is gibberish. I don't know if you've heard, but I do have a Patreon.